Hi everyone, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm the Director of Archives at Linfield University, newly renamed Linfield University as of July 1, 2020. I'm here in the Nicholson Library, the Austin Reading Room. The archives are right behind the wall behind me here, so that's where I spend most of my time. I'm here today to talk about Linfield before it was Linfield, Tales from McMinnville College, which was the original name of the institution where we are now. This is an archivist talk, so I'm hoping you're expecting to be really dry and boring. That's what I'm going for today. Hopefully we'll have some fun. This is actually a really interesting story, and I hope you'll enjoy this. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to McMinnville's for hosting this and for having me back for an encore performance. And thank you to all the people who are here helping us from the communications department at Linfield. Before we start with this, I want to talk a little bit about what an archive is and why we exist. So when I did this presentation the first time last March, which seems like 1,000 years ago to all of us, I'm sure. We did a little Q&A part here where we kind of talked about what an archive is and why, but the short answer for an archive is a way to preserve history, a way to collect the history that we have at an institution in this case, or whatever business or organization or even household you have. So. And the why is interesting. You have stories like this where you want to look back at your own history from 150, 160 years ago, and if you don't collect it along the way, there's no real way to examine your own history. So an archive's job is to collect that history, to preserve it, and also to share it with as many people in as many ways as it can. So here at Linfield, we have four main collections. We have the Linfield University history, of course. The school goes back to the 1850s, which we'll talk about in a moment. We have history going all the way back. In the 1980s, Linfield added a Portland campus, a nursing campus that used to be Good Samaritan School of Nursing. So when that became part of Linfield, we took over their history as well. So we have the Good Samaritan School of Nursing collection. Linfield, as you'll hear much about tonight, was founded by American Baptists. So we have a lot of early American and Northern Baptist history. And we have the Oregon Wine History Archive as well, which is kind of our most unique collection. Makes a lot of sense in a place that has a Baptist archive as well. Probably not a lot of places in the world where you can find Baptists and wine in the same archival collection. But those are kind of our main collections. So we're open by appointment. We are here to help with if you have research interests about any of those things, or McMinnville, Yamhill County history. My contact information will be on the last slide here, or you can Google me and send me an email anytime. I'd like to stipulate before I start that I'm not in any way the foremost expert on Linfield or on McMinnville. I've only been at Linfield since 2011, and a lot of the history I've picked up, but there are people who've been here a lot longer and know a lot more of the history firsthand than I do, and there's a lot of different ways to tell the story as well. So this presentation is culled together from a number of early Linfield history sources. Much of it's true, some of it probably isn't. We're doing our best here tonight. It could be a little apocryphal, but this is kind of the story the way it was told. So the story we're going to see tonight is a story of a town and a college that grew up together. McMinnville and Linfield are roughly the same age. And so there's it's an unlikely success story. A lot of perseverance, there's a lot of stubbornness, there's a lot of luck. I often tell people when I give a tour, when I meet someone here, that there's no way that Linfield University should exist in McMinnville, certainly, and maybe not at all. There's a lot of times along the way that the school shouldn't have survived, and it certainly shouldn't have survived where it is. So there's a lot of interesting parts of the story that where Linfield's kind of at death's door and gets rescued by something or someone. I think people tend to think of institutions that survive as kind of growing in a kind of a straight, steady manner. This is much more of a roller coaster. Linfield has been a roller coaster since the beginning. There have been ups and downs, and they come frequently and kind of right on top of each other. So I think it's an interesting way to look at the first 80 or so years of Linfield's existence to see that kind of roller coaster. So when we did this in person at McMinnville's, we made a drinking game of this. So as you look ahead, as I get into this, every time I say that, if you want to play along at home, every time I say that the board of directors wanted to shut the school down and move it to Portland, have a drink of whatever your favorite beverage is, and by the end we'll all be really nice and relaxed. So set the stage for Linfield. Oregon Trail, obviously. Linfield is the result of the Oregon Trail, the Great Migration. So the Louisiana Purchase and Lewis and Clark, early 1800s, really kicked up, and the wagon trains kind of started in the 1830s and 1840s. Missionaries blazed the Oregon Trail. and the missionaries were kind of the driving force behind it. Every religion wanted to claim its place, set up its outposts, educate, and of course save the natives that were here. So there was the Whitman mission route that came from the east that was just filled with missionaries of every denomination you can imagine, and they all tried to set up schools here. So in 1844, the American Baptist Home Society sent Ezra Fisher and Hezekiah and Eliza Johnson west. They had both Ezra and Hezekiah had experienced founding Baptist schools in the Midwest. There was a very small number of Baptists in the Oregon Territory at the time, and there were even a smaller number of Baptists who were interested in higher education. So it was an uphill battle, to say the least. The Baptist Home Mission Society started a primary school in Oregon City in 1848. But Fisher and Johnson their goal was a college. They were focused on this idea of a college. They founded the Oregon Baptist Education Society in 1849, and they renamed the school Oregon City College, which was at the time a complete misnomer. It was an ambition, but they were in no way a college. There was the idea that kind of sound learning and Christian education would go hand in hand. That was the goal of the school. There was a disagreement over the original location, so they moved it into the actual city of Oregon City, such as it was at the time. There was no funds, there was no resources, there was no building. And this was kind of a common case across Oregon. There's a line in one of the Linfield history publications that calls Oregon a college morgue. At the time, there were dozens and dozens of schools that were tried to start in the 19th century, late 1800s, and very few survived. In 1851, the Baptist Mission Society sends George Chandler out west. He had been the president of Franklin College, a Baptist school in Indiana, and he helped get a building erected in Oregon City that would be the future home of this school. But there were still no college students. This was still a primary school called a college. And George Chandler stayed for about a year and then left, stayed in the area. We'll get back to him in a moment. He becomes important again. So the Baptists have this school in Oregon City. It's a few years old. It's struggling. It doesn't have any money. There's not really any support. The original president has left. They hire J.D. Post in 1852 to be the president, and they have immediate prosperity because they have a president with leadership, but he also has immediate issues with the Board of Trustees. One of the main issues being that J.D. was in favor of having women as scholars at the college, and the Board of Trustees was not. So he left. The Board of Trustees incorporated the school, called it Oregon City University. As he was leaving, he started his own school just miles away. They both failed. There was no local support. There was a lot of infighting. There was no understanding of what was going on in the Oregon Territory. The schools were mostly being led from 2,000 miles away, and there was just no concept of what it was like in the Oregon Territory at the time. So Ezra Fisher, who we saw a few seconds ago, he led a group from the Baptist Society to assess the merits of 6 potential sites to start the next school. They were bound to try. They were going to succeed eventually. So they looked at Oregon City, Lafayette, Cincinnati, which is now called Eola, or the Eola area, Santiam, Albany, and of course the Oregon capital at the time, Oregon Territory capital at the time, which was Corvallis. So McMinnville, not even on the radar, not even a twinkle in the eye yet for the Baptists. So McMinnville, at the same time this is all happening, McMinnville is being founded. This is William Newby, who's among the original founders of McMinnville. The town is named McMinnville because William Newby grew up in McMinnville, Tennessee, and renamed the city McMinnville when he got here. He had a profitable grist mill and was kind of one of the city leaders. A few years later, Sebastian Adams arrives in 1850, and Adams and Newby kind of teamed together to promote land along the river to get settlements here. So 1850-ish, there's about 300 residents in McMinnville, the village of McMinnville. Adams and Newby have this idea that if they build a building, a high school, they might attract buyers. They might get someone to buy into the area. So Newby donates 5 acres and builds a large L-shaped building, which sounds great, but I use build in the most rudimentary possible way. It was a big, ugly building. It looks very nice from the front, but it was basically unfinished on the inside. None of the rooms were actually carved out. The walls weren't exactly finished. It looks like a big building here, but you're basically seeing all of it because it's an L shape. And so it was too ungainly. It was too big to be a high school as they originally intended. They offered it to the Christian church. First of all, the Christian church was already trying to establish schools in Bethel and now Monmouth. They eventually founded both schools, and they later merged to what is now Western Oregon University. So they have this idea. They have the idea to build this building, to create this place for a school to come. They just don't have the church, and so they happen to hear that the Baptists need a building. They hear that they're scouting all these sites, and they make an offer in June 1856. The Baptists say, "Hey, there's a town with a building. That's half the battle. That's what we're looking for." And the folks in McMinnville say, "Hey, there's people with money. That's what we're looking for." And so it's a pretty great match on paper until you look at the fact that, again, McMinnville had 300 residents, roughly, a few hundred more than that maybe. No Baptist presence in the town, no Baptist church, no Sunday school. Nobody in the town really terribly interested in a college education, as we would call it today. And the Baptist leaders were still convinced that this was the way to go. They were convinced that this was the place to build their church, to build their school, and so even despite all of the reasons not to, they raised enough money to complete the building. We'll say complete again. It was never really completed. They made it livable, and they hired John Wesley Johnson to be the original teacher at the school in 1857. So that kind of bridged to the original founding. We'll get to where the school goes in a moment, but the original college is where the First Baptist Church now is. This is the church that's in McMinnville now is the fifth First Baptist Church, fifth building on the site here in McMinnville. And when the school left, as we'll get to in a little bit, the first church went up. So January 19th, 1858, the newbies donate 10 acres and a building to the trustees of this college, and that officially starts what is now Linfield University. There were a number of interesting conditions attached. The most interesting to me of which is that there would be no alcohol ever on campus, which is at least fair because we're not on that campus anymore. So you can at least we outlived that promise. But and he also convinced the board to keep the school called a college. We didn't want it to be called a school, didn't want it to be called a high school. Even if it wasn't going to act as a college, he wanted it called one. That was the aspiration the Baptist had, what the Baptist Society had, was to get the school to be a college at some point. So it was an aspiration more than a reality. January 30th, 1858, the Oregon Territorial Legislature, this predates Oregon as a state, so still territorial legislature, and charters the Baptist College in McMinnville. Here's the first page of the bill. It was a 5-page bill. That's all it took in those days to start a college here in Oregon. They hired Chandler again. Here's a nicer picture of the charter. And so they hired George Chandler, who had been the president in Oregon City, to come back, and they were going to have classes starting in the fall of 1858. So this says the regular summer term of this institution will commence on Monday, April 12th, 1858, and will continue 22 weeks. And it lists the teachers, including Reverend George C. Chandler, president and professor of moral and intellectual philosophy. And more than that, George Chandler was a little bit of everything. He was the president, he was the teacher, he was the repairman, he was the cook, he was the cleaner. It was a very pragmatic setup. There were not a lot of adults there, so it was a lot of everybody had to do a little bit of everything. They hired 2 teachers to start, J.D. Post and C.H. Mattoon. J.D. Post, C.H. Mattoon, and G.L. Russell, 3 teachers. And so when the school went up, it was also the only public. It was also going to be the public school in McMinnville. So it was the first public school in McMinnville, the only one until 1875. There were 44 students to start. Its student increased to 70. So the notion, again, it was a college, but what it really was a really big and fancy, trying to be fancy elementary school, charter school for a lot of people. It was the only school in town, and people came to it with whatever education level they had. So it sounds like immediate success. You have 44 students to start with, they go to 70, but there was really no immediate success. There were other religious schools in the area that were taking away from the few people who were interested in colleges. So Willamette, founded by the Methodists, and Pacific, founded by the Congregationalists, were both kind of attracting students as well. Regional Baptists didn't unite behind the school, which was run by the Central Baptist Association. They preferred other locations, including Corvallis and Oregon City, where there were more people. And right after the school was founded, the Civil War broke out and split the Baptists just like everyone else. There were pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions, and they didn't unite behind anything, let alone the school. Students were in short supply, Baptists especially so, and college students doubly especially so. So very few people were interested in a classical education that the Baptists had in mind. Lack of Baptist students led to lack of support from Baptist associations. There was also this kind of the reality of the fact that students couldn't just stop what they were doing and go to school like we think of now, often called away to work, back to the farm for harvest. So in addition to students who were being often called away to work and unable to focus on college like the way you would really want to, it was also really hard to sell the benefit of a college education, especially a classical college education, to frontiers people. There was not much need for Cicero or for Latin or for things like that. It was hard to sell people on the need for this kind of thing. So I mentioned earlier the College of Oregon. The number that they estimated was that fewer than 2 of every 10 colleges that were founded in America before the Civil War still survive. So, and Oregon was right on that line in terms of 80% failure rate, basically. So we talked about the building a little bit earlier. There were quarters for men and women. It was the town school, K through 12, plus college, plus church, plus Sunday school. Students brought their own everything, stoves, all kinds of heating and cooking equipment. Occasionally they brought their own cows, and they were grazed in the field outside the college. There was no sewage system, so sewage went out the windows often when no one was looking. There's a quote in Linfield's 100 Years, which is a great reference source if you're looking for early Linfield history. The quote is graphic. Stains down the wall were evidence that the boys didn't always heave hard enough. So that's kind of to give you an idea of what this building was that they were dealing with here, and what the town was at the time. The students at the time, almost none were full-time students. Like I said, they were always pulled away by family needs. Very few were above an elementary or middle school level. Only a couple at the college. Student body hovered in the 70s or 80s at this point, but fluctuated rapidly. Attendance was sporadic and irregular was the terms that were used, which sounds about right. Students moved up. At the time, there were no ceremonies. There was no graduation. There was no commencement, nothing like that. Let's talk about the presidents for a second. So we talked about George Chandler. He started in Oregon City, stayed in Oregon City, and then was named the first president of the college. 1858 to 1860, he served as the president. Got the college started, but right from the beginning, the question of site was always on the mind of the board. Wouldn't it be better off if we shut the school down and moved it to Portland? That was from the start, even when things were going well. That was the first thought was Portland was where the people were. Portland was where Baptists were. Portland was where college education seekers were, so we should go there. So Chandler got started. He was the president for a couple of years. You'll notice some gaps in the timeline here. There are years when there is no president, or there are no presidents of record. It was not always easy to get someone out here, and we'll get to a few points in the history in the future here where. Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But so George Chandler was the first president. John Wesley Johnson was hired as the second president. It's one of my favorite stories because he here from 1864 to 1867, so there was a little gap during the Civil War where there was no real president. He improved attendance all the way up to 104. Made small improvements to the building. I don't know what small improvements to the building means exactly, but from what they started with, they didn't have to do much to make it better. The college was debt-free for its first time. The sad thing is that John Wesley Johnson left as president of the college to become an elementary school teacher. And eventually, later on, became the first president of the University of Oregon. So bounced around a little bit, but I feel like your college president leaving to become an elementary school teacher is kind of a bad sign for how things are going at your school. Then I mentioned the roller coaster earlier. So now we're at a good point in the roller coaster, and now we're gonna free fall for a little while. So there's a 6-year gap where the school is largely leaderless, taking on debt, conditions deteriorating, the building falling apart a bit. Next president is Mark Bailey in 1873 to 1876. He had a really good idea for raising money. He sold what we call permanent scholarships to families to raise quick cash. So these were scholarships that would work in perpetuity for families, so you bought one, and as many people as you could send to the school, you could send to the school. So again, raised quick cash, but also quickly ate away at any future profits. Went out for fundraising efforts in the 1870s. A yellow fever outbreak cut into those efforts. As we're dealing with now, you never know when an illness might cut into your efforts. He did manage to get the Baptists more united behind the school. Civil War was a decade over, and the fracture had faded. The dreams certain parts of the Baptist community had of a rival school in Corvallis, Oregon City, Portland, elsewhere had kind of faded. his idea was that McMinnville College could strive to be the Baptist college in the Northwest because there was no other Baptist college in the Northwest at that time. Of course, the college, which was struggling after its 6 bad years, couldn't cover any costs, including Bailey's salary. So he was unpaid, which led him to leave. At this point, of course, the Board of Trustees' idea was they should probably shut it down, move it to Portland, where the people were. The next president was a local guy whose name I believe is not really known. It just mentions a local businessman. He lasted 7 months. They had to borrow money to pay him as well. They hired his replacement, a man named S.B. Morse. He was supposed to start in the fall of 1877, was hired by the Central Baptist Association, never showed up in McMinnville, which is, again, a bad sign for your school if your president doesn't show up. I often wonder what happened to him, if he just got as far as Montana and decided this was far enough, this is good, or what. But this is, unfortunately, in Linfield's history, not the only time that a president or teacher was hired and didn't show up. There were multiple years where there weren't the faculty who were supposed to be at the beginning of the year didn't come, so just were hired but never showed up. So again, this has been a recurring theme after Bailey. So again, after Morse doesn't show up and there's no president, the obvious answer is to shut it down and move it to Portland, or in this case, sell and move it to Portland. Then they hired G.J. Burchett, and now we're kind of back on the way up on our roller coaster. One of his first hires was D.C. LaTourette, one of the first of many LaTourettes in the college's history. They were a huge family in early Linfield. We'll call it McMinnville College at this point. President Burchett, I should have mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that's interesting about the school at the time was basically the fortunes were entirely reliant upon the president. So if there was a good president, things were good. If there was a bad president or no president, things were bad. And you kind of see that here. So Burchett kind of brings things back up. He reduced the number of classes, but increased the number of students. He branched the education out a little bit by adding a bookkeeping class. The school's first official foray into business education. He balanced the budget. He was very young. He was only 30 years old, persuasive speaker and preacher. His quote about the time of the school, he quote, "I saw no special hope for the college in that day. In fact, the Board of Trustees told me frankly that they were not hopeful. But they did not believe that it ought to be given up without sacrificing some man at least in trying to establish it, and I might as well be sacrificed as anyone else." So kind of played the martyr, played the sacrifice, and actually kept it going. He went searching for students and made contacts everywhere. So he was basically touring around looking for students everywhere up and down the West Coast, going to schools, going to churches, going to homes, and recruiting for the first time really in the school's history. But constantly being rebuffed, as you might imagine, from people who didn't want to send their kids to a small Baptist school in Frontier, Oregon. And so he was asked what he could offer students that might come to McMinnville, and this is his incredibly sad answer. "As to apparatus, well, as I recall it, we had an old apple box full of broken Leyden jars. We had an ancient air pump into which you might put a mouse and pump all day, and he would sit there in perfect comfort and smile at you. We had about as many books for a library as a generous old maid could carry in her large white apron. And we had an old-time mounted spherical geography. The whole structure was little else than a tinderbox. The sills rested on large, irregular-shaped boulders, and it slipped off these outwardly, leaving the floors behind. The building would not keep out water when it rained, nor wind when it blew, nor cold when it froze. The second-story rooms were largely sealed with cloth. The students, for want of better gymnasium, had performed the circus act of leaping through the hoop until the cloth hung from the rafters in great strips and flaps. It hung in reach of every kerosene lamp, candle, or match. Often it did actually take fire. On one occasion, a student had set his ash box in the upper hall with some coals he got still alive. That unlucky student happened to smell the smoke, got up and went to the well downstairs, filled his old cowhide boot with water, and poured it on the blaze to extinguish it. Imagine a room with a shelf-like connection in every room. We had three in all for recitations, and whatever was done in one room sounded more or less in all the other rooms. This is what we had to offer prospective students." So a tough sales pitch for a very, very realistic president at that time. He wanted to begin a capital campaign to replace the building. He saw the building as the main source of issue. The trustees resisted. They assumed Burchett would probably fail, and then we'd have to close the college and move it to Portland. So the board at that point actually explored relocation options, but decided that McMinnville was the best fit, and that was largely because of the generosity of the town. And this is something I'll talk about later, but we talk about the town and the college growing up together. Part of the reason they did is because of the support they they gave each other. In the early days, a lot of town support. At that point, McMinnville raised $20,000, a huge sum of money in the 1870s and 1880s to keep the college afloat and keep it happy. But the question of the building was still. The question of the building was still kind of on everyone's mind. It was never a good building to start with. Now it was 25 years. They'd lived in it and thrown sewage out the windows. And so, it's not really what they were looking for. So it was not in good shape. It was not sufficient. They couldn't grow it. The board was scared of taking on debt, but they knew they needed a new building. And so they started looking around for other sites. And what ended up happening was they ended up moving to the campus we're on now, or adjacent to the campus that we're on now. In the 1880s, President Burchett, this is Samuel and Mihaela Cozine, he befriended them. They were local farmers, and they donated 20 acres to the college. And President Chandler, who had passed away at this point, his widow, donated 5 extra acres. And that was the original new campus for McMinnville College. Burchett had raised the $20,000 for the building, but then resigned because of the lack of confidence of the board. The town helped raise the money. It helped with building and materials, of course. Here's the warranty deed from the Cozines to the college. The best part about this is in our archives. This transaction was made in 1883. The date on this is October 31st, 1892, because it took them almost a decade to get someone out here to notarize the deed. That's how out of the way McMinnville was at the time. This is the cornerstone was laid in the May of 1882 for the new building, at that point unnamed building. This talks about the 3 different celebrations, which are interesting. The third celebration, which was not recorded in the trustees' minutes, was impromptu and emphatic. When the brickwork was finished and the 4-story wall stood complete, the exuberance of the masons and hod carriers was expressed in a convivial fellowship around a keg of beer, which I don't think the school people would have been really fond of at the time, but at least the building was complete. So the new McMinnville College on its new land, this is what became known as Pioneer Hall. For the most of its early life, it was just called the new building or the building or McMinnville College or the campus or whatever, because there was literally one building and an old oak tree out front. So it was dedicated on June 12th of 1883. The new president, E.C. Anderson, oversaw the groundbreaking. So again, this is an entire college wrapped up into one building. So it was dorms, classrooms, laboratories, chapel, boarding hall, apartments for the president and some of the faculty, a study hall, a library, a literary society, and a music studio. Literally an entire university in one building. Shortly after, they put a printing press that was run by a student, later home to the Review, in the basement. All rooms were minimally furnished and equipped, which is a term I just love, that minimally furnished and equipped. Students could either purchase wood for their stoves or they could chop it themselves. There was no water until 1895, but there was a windmill outside, which you can see on the side of this picture. And kerosene lamps and candles were the only heat and light source until 1907. My favorite part about when it was actually wired, when Pioneer Hall was first wired, it was actually wired by students. So the fact that it's still standing over a century later after that tells you how good those student electricians were back in the 1900s. A couple different views of the campus. This one's a little bit later with Colonial Hall, which we'll talk about in a little bit next to it there. From an old postcard of Pioneer Hall. Here's Cozine Bridge looking down the way at Pioneer. And here's the old oak, which unfortunately we don't have very many pictures of the old oak. It was not something that anybody really liked taking pictures of and putting it in postcards and taking it from different angles and all of that. So the old oak, which fell not too long ago, and the wood is being used all over the campus now, was the original symbol of the school. So we'll take a quick look at the inside of Pioneer Hall. This is President E.C. Anderson. Here's the physics cabinet and apparatus from old Pioneer Hall. The science lab. Science lab from a different angle here. The old library. So our library is a little bit nicer today. Music conservatory, which is just a great shot. I love the ferns personally myself. Some of the early faculty, including Miss Trumbull, the owner of perhaps the greatest hat this town's ever seen. She was principal of the Conservatory of Music. Here's a bit look at the course catalog. I mentioned earlier how hard a sell this was for pioneer folk. Freshman class, algebra, Herodotus, Roman history, the Odyssey, Grecian history, geometry. This is freshman year. It gets better. By junior year, you're into calculus and elements of criticism and multiple years of German, acoustics, mental sciences, metaphysics, botany, and then by your senior year, astronomy, political economy, evidences of Christianity, et cetera, et cetera. So a tough curriculum. This is from the oldest course catalog we have from the 1870s. Finally, there's a little bit of success for the school. The first college graduate, 1884, so that's 36 years after the school was founded, for those counting. J.H. Smith, who later was a prominent attorney in Astoria, graduated 1884. The curriculum at this point was the equivalent to what we would now consider a community college or junior college, basically 6 years from the beginning of high school, so a two-year education roughly in 4 years. The second grad was Amasa Sanders, who later took over Dallas Academy School. So in the next 10 years, starting 1884, there were 36 graduates total. A slow but rolling start. There's a lot of descriptions of classes at this time, college classes at the time, mostly being one-on-one with student and faculty because so few students were at college level. So at least a good excuse to do your homework and do your reading before time because no one else is going to get called on instead of you. One of my favorite things I was reading through 100 Years, they hired the first preceptress, which was sort of like a head female teacher. And this is what they were looking for, quote, a lady of 35 summers or more, experienced in teaching, and a model of ladylike deportment. I don't know that they found her. They must have found her because they did hire her. So things were going pretty well at the time for the college. Graduates were happening, but still, financial peril, as always. 1886, $600 under budget. The trustees said, $600, we're going to shut this place down and move it to Portland. The money was raised the evening before the term was supposed to begin. So the school started a little late that year. President Anderson resigned because of poor health after a lot of crises, I imagine. Next president was Truman Brownson, T.G. Brownson. He was hired in 1887. He was the longest tenured president at the school. By the time he was done, he'd been there for almost a decade. He did a lot of things to help the school going, so now we're back on a roller coaster up again. First thing he did was hire Emmanuel Northup, who was the head teacher here for basically 40 years. He was kind of one of those long-serving, much-beloved institutional cornerstones that every institution, every college needs to kind of anchor. Presidents were coming and going. Students have obviously come and go. You have to have something that kind of permanence, and Northup proved to be that, which is why we eventually named the library after him. President Brownson came. There was 100 students here at the college. Only 7 of them were studying at the college level. His first thought, they asked him what he thought about McMinnville. His quote was, "I had never seen a more desolate-looking place in my life." Again, a bit of an uphill battle. But between Brownson and Northup, over the next decade, it slowly started looking like a college. In kind of a funny way, because the first thing they did was shorten the college course by eliminating the 4th year and shortening it to a 3-year curriculum. But they stressed getting students to graduation, not just getting them some college. They wanted to get students here and through. Brownson was convinced that only through denominational support could the school survive. So he and Northup helped create the Oregon State Baptist Convention with Brownson as the president to throw their support behind the school. It's, again, still called McMinnville College. Then, in a twist, this time it wasn't the board, but Brownson who wanted to shut the school down and move it to Portland because he found that's where the money was. As it's described, Portland was the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for many involved in the school over the years. So he kind of gets everyone riled up. They're going to move the school to Portland. We'll go back to Brownson here for a second. Going to move the school to Portland, and then the support wanes, as it usually did. Something went wrong. Somehow the mind was changed. And then they started to rally support in McMinnville, which was a nice change. They began the school's first endowment, again, 40 years into the school's history. And they started to make the school look a bit more like a college, so more of the things we would look for today in a college. So started YMCA and YWCA chapters. These were independent of church activities. These were kind of student-run, student organizations. One of the things that the cabinets would do, here's the YWCA, here's the YMCA. the young men and young women, they would meet new students at the train station and bring them to campus, help them get acclimated. It was a Christian organization, but the idea was almost like what we would consider like an admissions office today, admissions students. Here's more of the YMCA conference. Good times on the river. The first required religious course in the school, which is kind of amazing to me, the first required religious course was taught by Northup. It was called Church History and It's called Church History and Homiletics. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Homiletics is the art of preaching and writing sermons. And Northup taught that for 40 years here. So again, this is all 40 years after the school was created, which kind of speaks to the continuing precariousness, I believe, to borrow a term, of the college. It was always teetering on the brink. So it's during the 1890s that the school first starts to kind of, like I said, resemble a college. YMCA and YWCA are founded here. And that's when the Baptist commitment to life and learning become linked. Religious devotion kind of permeates the college. There's kind of a religious fervor with the YMCA and YWCA as the outlets for it, but many other ways as well, the church courses and others, and students' excitement. The first female graduate at that time, her name was Ida Skinner. She graduated in 1891. She became a missionary overseas. And the school expanded as far as it could in one building. Expanded the library, expanded in music instruction. The music instruction was on high demand at the time. And then they acquired the campus's second building, which is the observatory. For those of you who don't know, the second oldest building on campus is the observatory. There on the side. It's no longer in that location. It's been shipped over to this side of campus, but it's been here since the 1890s. The building in front of it is called Colonial Hall. At the time, it was just called the Music Building. When the school decided it wanted to have a music conservatory, they quickly and cheaply, as was the style of the times, built this building with no intention of making it last. I don't know if you can tell from the photo, but it doesn't really have a foundation. It was just sort of built. It actually lasted quite a while. I found out, I had heard it had burned down. I recently found out that it burned down a planned burning. When the building was ready to go, the McMinnville Fire Department used it as a practice building when they burned it down. So this was the campus at the time. Pioneer Hall is just to the right of this picture as you're facing it, and then Colonial Hall and the observatory. But the Music Conservatory helped them expand their student body, helped them expand the curriculum, helped bring in a lot of students who are interested in music. Other buildings started to arrive later. This is Newby Hall, named after William Newby, who we talked about earlier. So at this point, the school we're going into about 50 years here. We're getting into the early 1900s. So we're getting into the early 1900s, and this is McMinnville College entering its second half century of history, and they're very happy at this point. They want to be the greatest light in the Northwest. That's what this says. This little ad in their college catalog. At this point, other Baptist schools had tried and failed in the Northwest. There was a notable one in Seattle and in Spokane that had both come and gone. Somehow, this little college in the middle of nowhere had managed to survive and was the Baptist college in the Northwest, and kind of grudgingly and stubbornly had gained support from Baptists throughout the West Coast especially, but the Central Baptist Association in the middle of the country as well. So against all odds, was still here and was still, well, we won't say thriving, but it was surviving, and things seemed like they're going well. So they had this great vision of the future. This is from that same college catalog. It might be a little hard to see, but this is the vision they had for this kind of centralized part of campus, with a gated entry that was very fancy, and multiple buildings. And eventually the campus does come to look something like this, minus the gated entry, but it's not anytime soon. So don't worry, there's still plenty more roller coaster to go before we get there. So activities on campus started around the turn of the century. We have some photos here. This is from a baseball game. You can see Pioneer in the background. The Linfield Review started in the late 1890s. The review staff here, baseball team. It's a little bit later, but I love the old wool uniforms, the great McMinnville logo, and of course throwing in a wool coat for some reason. Football team, not a lot of money for pads or uniforms at that point, but or large players, but they fought hard, they battled. The track team, again, Pioneer in the background, and here's the track. No expenses were spared. The women's athletic class, one of my favorite stories. Those are dumbbells, I guess. Those are women in full dress with one dumbbell each, because I guess two would have been too much. A couple of them maybe have two, but one of my favorite visions of the early college is these poor women doing calisthenics, I guess, in their full dress. Other activities of early interest, the first kind of star sport that the school had was oratory and rhetoric and debate. Those were all the sort of the star athletes. What you would think of now as maybe football players on campus, the big men on campus. They were the orators at that point. So McMinnville College had strong programs from the beginning in male and female oratory. So sports were a distant second to speech and debate at that time. I'm going to go back to the football for just a second. I missed something with the football team. So football was started. Once we get to President Riley here in a few minutes, he shut football down from 1906 to 1922, along with much of the country. President Teddy Roosevelt at the time had deemed football a danger after dozens and dozens of on-field deaths had occurred because of lack of safety precautions. So for a while, McMinnville didn't have a football team, and then it came back and wasn't really much of a football team for about another 30 years. So what we think of now with the school and its football tradition is a newer tradition than that. So also in the early days, coaches were eligible to play and often did play because of lack of players. So I don't know if there's a coach in that picture or not, but the coaches were known to play. Here's a champion debate team. Like I say, the debate or oration was the star sport at the school. These guys were rock stars. This is the 1903-1904 champion debate team, including one of the Latorettes. I mentioned Latorette earlier. This is I believe Kenneth Latorette. Is in this picture. In 1896, Charles Galloway was the state intercollegiate oratorical champion. I guess it was the pride of the school. When he came back to town, there was a celebratory parade down what is now 3rd Street, and the town and Gowan both honored him. So other activities, band and glee. Like I said, the music conservatory, music education cost extra from the students, so it actually brought in more revenue, one of the reasons they were excited about it. By the 1890, more students were enrolled in music than were enrolled in what you would call the regular college, so band and glee grew quickly. Marching band, this always reminds me of the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band for Beatles fans out there. Different picture of the marching band a little bit later, but as you can see now, we brought the marching band back. Good strong tradition there. Other traditions of the day, Women's Glee Club as well. In the middle, in the black, that's Mother Potter from Potter Hall. She was one of the most beloved faculty members of the early day. Her house, what is now Potter Hall, it was originally the president's house before the new president's house was built. Other traditions of the day included May Day. This is the May Queen. We had many May Queens. May Day ran every year from 1904 to 1969, when, like many traditions, it died at the end of the 60s and hasn't really come back. So May Day, like I say, it started in 1904 with the Maypole dance was kind of the main part of it. And at this point, we'll get into a little bit what the campus was like here in a minute. But dancing wasn't allowed on campus during the rest of the year, so this was like the time to dance. There was an official bard who would celebrate each year's May Queen in poetry. The May Queen was selected by her peers. There was a whole royal court. Here's a bit of the royal court. I apologize because the photos get creepier to me as we go through them here. May Day looks a little creepy now with the ceremony, but you can see this is the May Queen kneeling and being named. There's a prime minister involved. That was the highest ranking male position in this. There's little kids involved, which always is kind of weird too. It makes it look like a wedding. So this, and you can see on the left of the screen there's a jester as well, which is absolutely the creepiest part of all this. We'll get a better look at the jester here in a moment. Here's the processional of the May Queen. You can see the maypole here on the side as well. That's what they would dance around. Again, with little girls holding the train, just like we would consider a wedding today. Here's the jesters. So I'll just let you decide how creepy you think that is. But to me, there's a reason we don't have this photo up on our wall in the archives. It was interesting. So this started in 1904 and kind of took off after President Riley, who we're going to get to in a minute, takes over. And there was kind of a running joke that President Riley used May Day as kind of a pragmatic way. So May Day was the first Saturday in May, and the Friday before there was no classes, and it was called Campus Day, and that was a day for cleaning and beautifying. So it was basically a day for student labor to clean up the campus. They'd have one big party, and then it was basically summer at that point. So the joke was that he started May Day just so he could have Campus Day, or continued May Day so he could have Campus Day to clean up the campus. So, like I said, there was poetry. There were proclamations for the next year. Freshmen were like they would sort of burn things to to end their freshman status, to say they're officially here. The graduates would be named. Incoming members of the new service organizations would be named. One more May Queen and more jesters. Creepier or less creepy? I'll let you decide. I'm not sure. But you can kind of see this is what the royal court looked like. very, very much pomp and circumstance. So at this time also Greek life sort of started to become more of a thing. The first fraternity was actually a literary club called the Philurgian Society, 1874. Was a forum for skilled discourse and written composition, kind of a precursor to the oratory. A forerunner of social clubs, service clubs, and Greek letter fraternities and sororities. So in this time, fraternities and sororities started to come along. Here's the Delta Dogs. This is from 1905 with their mascot in the middle there. The Edelweiss sorority with just amazing outfits. Some fashions truly do stand the test of time, I think. Here's the Iota Omega Mu. So these were all local chapters. There was no national fraternity or sorority chapters allowed at this time. So these were all local chapters. Kappa Alpha Phi. Speaking of fashion that stands the test of time, those are newspapers that they're wearing there. This is the LL sorority. I don't know what that means. One of the questions I get asked a lot is like what campus life was like at that time, what people did. I'll tell you what they didn't do. We'll start with that. Things that were banned on campus or for any student at the college: alcohol, tobacco, billiard parlors, skating rinks, public dance halls, dancing in any kind, gambling of any kind. You couldn't do any of that. So what people did do, there were long romantic walks on the Cosine footbridge. This is Lover's Lane for many McMinnville College and Linfield students. Carriage rides around campus for those, I guess, who could afford it. Formal events, many formal events. Black tie. And they like taking pictures of the whole classes because you can fit the whole class in one camera shot really easily. So here's some class portraits and some group photos. They loved sitting on the stairs outside of Pioneer, or sometimes higher. We have some awesome shots that I'll get to in a moment of a slightly larger campus size, but I love this one because of the people sitting up on top of the stairs there. So going back to the college, things are going pretty well in the 1890s for the school. Brownson has been there for a decade. He leaves. The new president, 1896 is Harry Boardman. Things seem like they're going really well on the surface. The school has grown. There's all the things we talked about that are kind of growing and expanding. But like any time, there was always darkness on the horizon. There had been a financial crisis in 1893. A few years later, it was really starting to take its toll. We're in what was considered the darkest stretch in school history now for the next decade or so. Boardman and then President Brumback, who came in 1903 as the president. They both struggled with finances. Neither of them were terribly shrewd businessmen in any way. A lot of college assets were mortgaged, sold at that time. No additions to the operating budget or endowment. Teachers were often unpaid, often given IOUs that were, again, generously around town businesses and people would accept the IOUs, accept scrip for goods. So the IOUs would have then passed on to the businesses, but again, because the town's generosity allowed teachers to actually, eat. In 1898, the school, which had been known as Baptist College McMinnville, but largely called McMinnville College, officially shortened its name to McMinnville College, was often called Old Mac, which I think is just a great name for a college. And we'll talk a little bit about we talked a little bit about the IOUs. This is from Linfield's 100 Years. It says, every college needs a town. Sometimes the college dominates and the town is characterless. Sometimes they are antagonistic with much unhappiness. Sometimes the town dominates and the college is incidental and apologetic. The happiest arrangement is for each to retain its individuality while giving the other respect and affection. So it's truly like a marriage between town and gown. And this is pretty much true of most of the history of this school. So this is the darkest times here. Well, this is from Linfield's 100 Years again. Students could no longer pay tuition and board. Instructors had to accept warrants in place of salary, but the college carried on for their young people to teach. And while the college went on, the town maintained life and the instructors and the students. College families were permitted to run up bills far beyond reason and continue until better times. Students were helped with food and fuel, clothing and lodging. Many a McMinnville businessman clothed, fed, and furnished students beyond hope of repayment. This was perhaps the hardest drag ever made on the town, and the need was met generously and with exceeding kindness. The college will always remember. And I love this because, again, the school should not have survived. This was a time when there was less than no money for the school, and yet the town and the gown kind of came together just to force it through, basically, and make it work. Brumbeck resigns in 1905 after a couple of years of struggle. Twice the board hires a president, sets a start date, and the president doesn't show up. This is in the 1900s. This is like the school's 50 years old almost at this point. and the president doesn't show up either time. So both times, Northup assumed kind of an interim role as they scrambled to figure out the situation. But I think it's pretty telling again that even this far into the institution's history, there's zero margin for error at this point, and they couldn't even get presidents who they hired to actually show up and do the job. I mean, it's pretty sad and it's pretty telling. So this is from Bricks Without Straw, another wonderful book about early Linfield College, McMinnville College, written by Jonas Jonason. Quote, "By the end of 1905, the presidency of McMinnville College had been refused by 4 men, and the prospect of getting the right man was darker than ever. No one was willing to try making bricks without straw, when for a half-century able and determined men had failed in the attempt. Little wonder that some of the Portland members of the Board of Trustees decided that if a leader could not be secured, soon they would move. At the meeting of the board on January 10th, 1906, that the school closed its doors in June." So this is not even shutting it down, moving to Portland. At this point, Portland's still a dream, but at this point it's pretty much shutting the school down and not moving it anywhere. So there's kind of one last ditch effort here, and fortunately for the school, it worked. So this is Leonard Riley. He was the pastor of the First Baptist Church in McMinnville. So he was already in town, McMinnville. He was hired in 1901. His first task at the church was to eliminate the debt, and which he did in 6 months. He'd been a missionary for the American Baptist Home Mission Society and the secretary of the Oregon Baptist Convention, brought them out of debt as well, expanded their mission, so he clearly had a track record. He commented at one of the board meetings in late 1905 that late 1905, that before he saw McMinnville College close, he would take the presidency himself. And the Board of Trustees basically said, okay, it's yours. Called his bluff, I guess, or maybe not. So the first steps were, of course, financial. New financial bylaws, including oversight of the Board of Trustees, an immediate financial pledge from every board member, which had never been a part of the board before that. He asked for authority to nominate all board committees to make sure that the board was constantly invested and tied to the mission of the school. The term most commonly used for him was force of nature. He aimed to erase doubt and build the endowment, so he decided at this point, this is when he really started to try to bring the rest of the Northwest. So he attracted Washington Baptists, Idaho, etc. Baptists to make this the Baptist College of the Northwest. At this point, I mentioned earlier Colfax College, which was in Eastern Washington, Adelphia College, which was in Seattle. Both of them were, at this point, still hanging on as Baptist colleges. Leonard Riley went at them, basically, to compete with them directly, to bring students from Washington to McMinnville, which was unsavory to many Baptists in the area. They abhorred competition among Baptist schools. He's described as diplomatic but relentless. In a realm of scarcity, sufficient financing of one entity would come at the expense of others. He recognized that only one of these schools probably would survive, and he succeeded. Colfax College closed. Adelphia College was no longer a Baptist school, and Washington Baptists threw their support behind McMinnville College as the school. So this is when construction began on Music Hall, which we looked at earlier, 1908. A $7,000 building with no foundation. He put in central heating for the whole campus. Again, that's like 4 buildings in 1909. He reformed the curriculum our first look at what a modern college curriculum would look like with what they called clustered courses, a precursor to majors and minors, which came later, 1921. Extended back to 4 years for a degree. This is from one of the Linfield course catalog. McMinnville. I'm gonna do that a lot. I'm sorry. McMinnville College course catalogs. It says McMinnville College has advanced sufficiently in the past 2 years to meet the requirements of the Bureau of Education of Washington, D.C. of institutions that shall be known as standard. So it is now a standard college, 4-year education, what we would consider a modern college education, 4 years out of high school worth of education. So this is very exciting, of course, at the time. The students who graduate from McMinnville College in June of this year and thereafter, who have completed 15 semester hours, will receive certificates, which I just love. Riley became a bit of a rock star in the Baptist community, if that such a thing exists. This is from the Pacific Baptist, a journal at the time. There's a whole profile of McMinnville College written by him with photographs. There's Pioneer Hall there. As you can see, it talks about the past, present, and future of the school. This is only page 1. This is a multi-page spread he got here. I mentioned earlier the panoramic class photos. You can see what Riley was doing. He was building the school size. This is many more students than we saw even just a few years before. In 1910, Olaf Larsell, who has a hall named after him here. He's the first graduate of the new curriculum, of the new 4-year curriculum. Soon after that, President Riley started a great fundraising tour. 1913, he started with the Board of Education for the Northern Baptist Convention, led a campaign with a $300,000 goal, which was an unfathomable amount of money for the college at the time. There were certainly some setbacks. One of my favorite, in terms of interesting stories, James J. Hill, who owned the Great Northern Railroad, pledged $50,000 to match $50,000. If they raised $50,000, he would match it. They went out and raised most of that $50,000, and then James Hill died with nothing in writing and no will to leave the money to them. So that matching gift never happened. But there were more successes than failures. Finally, when it came to money fundraising, World War I in the middle of the 19-teens here. 167 McMinnville College students were part of World War I. Here's some on-campus training that was done at the time. 6 students died in the war. Enrollment had gotten all the way up to the 263, new high, all the way down to 104 during the war, almost entirely female. Gladys Strong, class of 19, the first female ASB president. Some interesting things happened during the war as well. They stopped offering, still offered German classes, but almost no one took them because it was not a good time to be taking German classes. In 1918, purchased the new President's House, which I mentioned earlier. It was now called Potter Hall. So the biggest contribution President Riley made after saving the school and originally getting it out of debt and getting it on the right track was securing the future. And the first way he did that was by recruiting a woman with a familiar name to the Board of Trustees. This is Frances Eleanor Ross Linfield, Mrs. Linfield. So she was recruited to the board in the mid-19-teens. She was the dean of students. She was the dean of women. And she was an incredibly shrewd businessman, incredibly impressive woman. She and her husband, George Fisher Linfield, both were working at a Baptist school in the Midwest, I believe in Wisconsin. He was the headmaster, she was the head teacher in a rare 2-income household. They socked money away each year. They lived off one of their salaries and saved the other with the notion of, at the end of life, giving a huge gift to Christian education. Unfortunately, George died in 1890, very young still. He never set foot in Oregon, which is an interesting fact since the school is technically named after him. Mrs. Linfield, who had family in Spokane, eventually came back to care for her parents. At this point, she had amassed quite a bit of wealth of her own through her own fund. Quite a bit of wealth of her own, and also had shrewdly purchased property in Spokane near her parents' house right before Spokane boomed as a railroad town, and so it made an immense amount of money there already. Also was in charge of a lot of her family money and family real estate, as we come to learn a little bit later. She came back to Spokane, had no connection to McMinnville College and no connection to McMinnville or to Oregon, but learned about President Riley and met him and was incredibly impressed with him and his goal for the mission of the school. And since money for Christian education was something that she and her husband had taken very seriously, decided that they would be a benefactor. So in 1922, this deal took a while to consummate, but she donated a lot of her land holdings in Spokane to the college. The college eventually sold them off for about $250,000 over the next 20 to 30 years. This was the first time Linfield, still McMinnville College for a moment, had ever had any kind of extra assets. She asked that the school be named for her late husband, so we were named for George Fisher Linfield, again a Baptist minister and teacher. Even though I think if you look at it closely enough, we're pretty much named for Mrs. Linfield because she did all the work and donated the actual land. So she donated money that got the campus going, and a separate fundraising adventure. A man named M.C. Treat, who donated anonymously to the school. He did not want his name or his family name attached to it, so his money went directly to start Melrose Hall. Melrose, named for Scotland's Melrose Abbey, which was Mr. Treat's favorite place in the world. He donated 10,000 shares of Pinmex fuel stock, which eventually sold for $383,000 to the school. So at the same time, Riley brought in 2 huge gifts. This is Melrose Hall being built. This is the new Linfield College at the time, with Pioneer Hall, Riley Gym, you can see in the middle there, New Melrose Hall there as well. So this is just a little bit after that. You can see the campus start to grow a little bit. This is Linfield in the snow just a little bit later. And the campus now, our first color shot. So from the humble beginnings. So it's interesting to look at the school's history, like I say, as a roller coaster, and it really did take getting to the darkest time in the early 1900s and finding President Riley. He spent 25 years as the president. He and his wife are interred here on campus. They were cremated, and their ashes are buried under the president's office at Melrose Hall. As far as I know, the only bodies on this campus. And so clearly left his heart here. He and his wife left their heart here and built the school up. And it's not to say that once we became Linfield, it's been smooth sailing by any stretch of the imagination. But from that point on, there was never the dread of constantly, the threat of constant closing or moving to Portland or anything else like that. So Linfield today, now Linfield University, hopefully surviving and thriving for a good long time beyond that.